There's a moment, and I've seen it happen more than once standing near these gates, where someone crosses a line they can't uncross. Not because they stumble, not because they trip, but because they decide to. This is about one of those moments, and I want you to understand something before I get into it. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And even now, years later, when I walk past that stretch of road near the palace, I still think about it. I still feel that sick pull in my stomach when I remember the sound. Because there was a sound. And once you hear a sound like that, a fist connecting with a horse, you don't forget it. Let me take you back. It was a Tuesday in late September, one of those London mornings that can't quite decide what it wants to be. The sky was that particular shade of gray that tourists photograph because they think it's dramatic, but locals just call Wednesday weather on a Tuesday. The kind of cold that hasn't committed yet, not sharp, not biting, just present. Like someone left a window open somewhere in the atmosphere. I'd been coming to this part of London for about 3 weeks at that point. I was doing some freelance photography work, not anything glamorous, just catalog stuff, but I had gaps in my afternoons, and gaps in London afternoons have a way of pulling you toward landmarks. So I'd started spending time near the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment's route, the one they ride between Hyde Park Barracks and Horse Guards. If you've never watched that procession, and I mean really watched it, not just glanced at it from across the road, then you're missing something. There's a formality to it that's hard to describe without sounding ridiculous. These men sit on these enormous horses, dressed in uniforms that look like they belong to a different century, and they move through central London like the city around them simply doesn't exist. Taxis, tourists, pigeons, all of it invisible to them. That morning I was positioned near the edge of the crowd. There were maybe 60, 70 people. A reasonable number for a Tuesday, a mix of European tourists, some school groups, a couple with matching rain jackets who I pegged immediately as American by the size of the camera one of them was carrying. The horses came through right on time. They always do. 2 mounted troopers riding in that slow, measured way. Their horses, both of them bays, beautiful animals, the kind that move like they know they're being watched, came down the route at the pace they always keep. Steady, unhurried, entirely in control. I was watching through my viewfinder, half thinking about the angle, half thinking about where I wanted to be for lunch, when I noticed a man pushing through the crowd toward the front. Now, people push toward the front all the time. Tourists do it constantly. You get used to it. But there was something about the way this particular man moved that made me lower my camera. He wasn't shuffling. He wasn't apologetic. He was cutting through people the way someone cuts through an empty room, like the others weren't quite real to him. He was tall, built in that particular way that reads as athletic even under clothing, wide through the shoulders, narrow at the waist, the kind of build that speaks to years of structured physical training rather than a gym membership used twice a year. He was wearing a black jacket over a fitted gray shirt. His hair was dark, cut short on the sides. He was probably somewhere in his mid-30s, though the confidence he carried made him seem older. The people he pushed past turned to look at him, then seemed to decide against saying anything, which I noticed seemed to be the reaction he was used to. He got to the front of the crowd right as the first horse was drawing level. And he just stood there, arms crossed, looking at the animal the way you might look at something in a shop window. I don't know what made me keep watching him. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that makes you pause when something in a room shifts slightly and you can't quite name what. The trooper on the first horse didn't look at the man. They're trained not to. Eyes forward, posture fixed. The horse, and this detail matters, was a gelding bigger than average with a quiet temperament that I'd noticed over several visits. A calm animal, well-conditioned. The man in the black jacket watched the horse pass his position. Then he reached into his pocket. I thought for one strange second he was going for his phone. He wasn't. He pulled out something small, I couldn't see what exactly from where I was, and held it down at his side loosely. Then he stepped forward, just one step, which put him past the edge of the barrier, technically into the path of the procession. People around him noticed. Someone said something in what I think was French. A woman near me made a small sound, the kind of sound people make when they're deciding whether to intervene. The horse registered him. Animals are extraordinary in the way they process threat, not with alarm, not immediately, but with a kind of stillness that changes quality. The gelding's ears moved. Its gait shifted fractionally. The trooper felt it. He had to. You don't ride at that level without reading your horse the way you read a face. He brought his eyes forward and kept them there. But the man in the black jacket wasn't trying to get the trooper's attention. He was looking at the horse. And then, and I want to be precise here because this is the part I still think about, he turned slightly, and he raised his hand, and he brought it down hard against the horse's flank. Not a pat, not a touch. A punch. Closed fist, a real one. The sound it made cut through everything. Through the crowd noise, through the distant traffic, through the general ambient hum of central London on a Tuesday morning. It was sharp and flat and wrong in the way that only sounds made by human violence against animals are wrong. The horse lurched. Not dramatically, it was too well trained for dramatic, but it lurched, and for one moment its hindquarters shifted and its head came up, and you could see it processing the shock of an unexpected impact. The crowd went absolutely silent. Not gradually, immediately. 1 second there was murmuring and shuffling and camera clicks, and the next second there was nothing. Just the sound of hooves finding their footing again, and the creak of leather, and the distant hum of a city that hadn't noticed yet. The man in the black jacket lowered his hand. He looked around at the crowd, this slow, almost theatrical scan, and then back at the trooper. Like he was waiting for something. Like he'd done this to produce a reaction and was now curious to see what it would be. Later, after it was all over, I talked to a woman who'd been standing 2 people to my left. She told me she'd recognized him before it happened. She'd seen his face somewhere, some martial arts competition coverage she'd caught on television, she said. She couldn't remember his name, but she remembered something a commentator had said about him, which she repeated to me almost word for word. He doesn't lose, and he doesn't apologize for winning. She'd said it with this flat, reporting tone. No editorializing, just the fact of it. I thought about that phrase a lot in the days that followed. He doesn't lose. Because that, I think, is the thread that runs through everything that happened next. This man, whoever he was, whatever he'd achieved, whatever rooms full of trophies he had at home, had constructed an identity so firmly around the fact of his own capability that he'd stopped being able to accurately assess what was around him. He'd looked at that horse and at that trooper and he'd thought, I could handle this. And he wasn't entirely wrong. He just wasn't accounting for what handling it would cost him. The trooper brought his horse to a halt. He did it the way you'd close a door, efficiently, without drama, no wasted motion. The gelding settled immediately. Horses know their rider's intention before the intention becomes action, and this one had clearly done this before. It stood there on the road, perfectly still, like it had been carved. The trooper looked down. Now I want to describe this moment carefully because I think it gets misunderstood when people talk about it afterward. People expect rage. They expect the trooper to be furious, red-faced, voice raised, hand on the hilt of something ceremonial. That's the image. That's the movie version. The reality was different. The trooper looked down at the man in the black jacket with an expression that I can only describe as entirely professionally empty. No anger visible, no shock, just attention, total, focused, unhurried attention. He didn't speak. The man in the black jacket held that gaze for about 3 seconds, which I know because I counted, and then he did something I genuinely didn't expect. He smirked. Not a big expression, just a slight lift at one corner of his mouth. The kind of smirk that says, I know exactly what you're going to do, and I'm not concerned. He said something. I was too far away to catch the words, but the woman to my left, the one who'd recognized him, said later that she'd heard it clearly. He'd said, easy now, just testing your reaction time. What happened next unfolded over approximately the next 4 minutes. And those 4 minutes, that specific, contained stretch of time, changed the shape of everything that followed. The trooper dismounted. He did it the way they always dismount, with precision, with control, without rushing. His second boot hit the ground and he handed the reins to his colleague, who had halted his own horse about 15 feet back and was watching with that same professional stillness. And then he turned to face the man in the black jacket. And he walked toward him. The crowd, which had been silent since the punch, pulled back. Not a conscious decision, just the unconscious physics of humans moving away from the center of potential energy. The man in the black jacket didn't move. He watched the trooper approach, and if he felt any change in the situation's gravity, he didn't show it. The trooper stopped about 2 feet from him. Up close the trooper was, and this registered even from my distance, bigger than he'd seemed on horseback, not in a showy way. Just in the way that genuine physical conditioning reads differently when it's standing in front of you on the ground versus when it's atop a horse 20 feet away. He spoke quietly. I still couldn't hear the words. The man in the black jacket responded. His tone was audible, if not his words, light, dismissive, the tone of someone who isn't taking the conversation seriously. He made a gesture with his right hand, a small, flicking gesture, the kind someone makes when they're batting away something unimportant. I looked at the trooper's face, and for the first time, the professional emptiness shifted. Not into rage, not even close to rage. Into something more deliberate than that. I've thought about this a lot, about what the expression on the trooper's face meant. There's a difference, and it's a real difference, not a subtle one once you've seen both, between a person who is angry and a person who has made a decision. Anger is reactive, it's hot, it changes things around the edges, makes them blurry. Decision is cold, it clarifies. The trooper's face in that moment was the face of a decision. Let me tell you something about the household cavalry. Not the ceremonial version that tourists photograph, though that's real too, and it matters, but the actual version. The version most people don't think about when they're watching the procession. These are not decorative soldiers. I don't mean that dismissively toward the ceremonial role, because the ceremonial role carries its own weight and history and dignity. But the men who ride those horses through central London have, in most cases, been to places and done things that the people photographing them couldn't begin to imagine. The household cavalry mounted regiment draws from the Blues and Royals and the Life Guards. These are regiments with active operational histories. Men who have served in various theaters, various roles, various contexts that have nothing to do with the carefully choreographed formality of a London procession. The uniform is one thing. The man inside the uniform is another. The man in the black jacket, the karate champion, the decorated competitor, the person who'd apparently decided that a public road in central London was an appropriate place to test an elite soldier's patience, had made a category error. He'd looked at the costume and decided he understood the wearer. He was about to receive the kind of correction that doesn't come from a judge's scoring and doesn't end with a handshake. The trooper spoke again. This time the crowd was quiet enough that fragments reached me, not full sentences, just pieces. Step back. Last time. Your choice. The man in the black jacket cocked his head slightly. He seemed to find something amusing. He said something that made the person standing next to me draw a sharp breath. I still don't know what it was. And then he raised both hands in that open-palmed gesture that martial artists use when they're squaring up without technically squaring up. Not a raised fist, open hands, tactical distance. The stance of someone who knows what they're doing with their body. The message was clear. I'm ready if you are. What happened next is the part I've replayed most often. Because it wasn't what the man in the black jacket was expecting. I'm certain of that. Whatever he'd prepared for, whatever mental script he'd run through, it didn't include what actually happened. The trooper didn't react to the stance. He didn't mirror it, he didn't lean in, he didn't change his posture in any visible way. Instead, he turned his head slightly, not breaking eye contact, just a fractional movement, and he said something over his shoulder. A single sentence directed at his colleague still mounted on the horse. And his colleague, calmly, without urgency, reached for his radio. That's when I heard the word police from somewhere in the crowd. Not shouted, just said, quietly, by someone who understood what the radio meant. The man in the black jacket heard it too. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not quite, but recalibration. The specific expression of a person who has been running one calculation and has suddenly received new data that requires rerunning it. He lowered his hands slightly. The trooper took one step forward. I want to be honest about the next 60 seconds, because different people who were there remember it differently, and I've compared notes with several of them over the following days. What we all agree on, there was contact. What we don't entirely agree on, the sequence. What I believe I saw, was that the man in the black jacket moved first. Not a full committed strike, more an establishment of intent. A forward shift of weight, a lifting of the right shoulder that anyone who's watched enough competition footage would read as the prelude to a technique. And the trooper didn't wait for the technique. He moved into the space. Faster than the man in the black jacket had apparently accounted for, because the expression that crossed the champion's face in that fraction of a second was unmistakably surprise. Real surprise, the involuntary kind, not performed. What followed was brief, controlled, and completely decisive. The trooper used leverage. That's the only way I can describe it without getting into specifics I'm not qualified to explain technically. He used the man's own forward momentum, added something to it, and the man in the black jacket, the competition fighter, the decorated champion, the person who had punched an elite soldier's horse and smirked about it, found himself against the ground. Not violently thrown, not slammed, just placed there, with complete authority and almost no visible effort. The whole thing took, I think, less than 4 seconds. The crowd made a sound. That collective exhaled noise that crowds make when something unexpected happens, and the body responds before the mind does. The man on the ground didn't move for a moment. He was processing. I could see it even from my position. The stillness of a person who has been given information they're not yet sure how to integrate. The trooper stood above him, completely still, breathing normally as far as I could tell, his uniform entirely undisturbed. He said something. Later, a teenager near the front. She'd had her phone recording for most of the incident, though the footage was shaky and partial, said she'd heard it. The trooper had said, "Stay there. The Metropolitan Police are on their way. If you stand up before they arrive, I'll put you down again." The man in the black jacket stayed on the ground. He lay there for what felt like a long time, though the woman with the time on her phone said it was about 90 seconds. And in that 90 seconds, something happened to the atmosphere around him. The crowd, which had gone silent during the physical confrontation, didn't erupt into the kind of noise you might expect. There was no cheering. This isn't a film, and real people in real moments of genuine tension don't behave like film audiences. There was murmuring. Phones appeared. People looked at each other with that particular expression that says, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" The trooper returned to his horse. Not in a rush, not as though he was retreating. He walked back with the same measured pace he'd have used in any other circumstance, took the reins from his colleague, and stood beside the gelding, one hand resting on its neck. The horse was calm. The horse, throughout all of this, had been almost preternaturally calm, which, if you know anything about horses and their relationship with stress and surrounding energy, is itself a testament to the trooper's control over the situation. Horses read their handlers. If the handler is controlled, the horse is controlled. The gelding's composure throughout this entire incident was partly a reflection of what was coming from the man beside it. The man on the ground eventually sat up. He looked at his hands, then at the crowd, then at the trooper. And then, and this is the detail that stayed with me most, he looked away. Just looked away, out toward the road, at nothing in particular. Like he was trying to find somewhere else to be. The police arrived in under 5 minutes. 2 officers initially, then a third. There was a conversation, calm, professional, the officers' voices at the kind of practiced neutral that police work requires. The trooper gave a brief account. His colleague confirmed it. Several members of the crowd offered accounts without being asked. The man in the black jacket sat on the ground through most of this, and then stood when asked to, and was led away. He didn't look at the trooper as he was taken past. I stayed at that spot for probably another 30 minutes after everything had resolved. I don't entirely know why. The procession had continued once things were clear. The second trooper had ridden ahead while the first dealt with the situation, and by the time the police were done, the immediate area looked almost normal. Just a stretch of London Road, with a thinning crowd and the distant sound of traffic. I talked to a few people, the French tourists, a retired couple from Edinburgh who'd been coming to watch the procession for years, the teenager with the phone. Everyone had their own version, their own detail that had snagged. For the Edinburgh couple, it was the stillness of the horse after the punch, the way it had collected itself and stood quietly while everything unfolded. For the teenager, it was the 4 seconds of the confrontation. She kept replaying it on her screen, phone tipped toward me so I could see the blurry footage. 4 seconds, she kept saying. He was on the floor in 4 seconds. For the French tourists, it seemed to be the trooper's return to his horse. The complete, unhurried normality of it. One of them described it in French and the other translated. He went back to the horse like nothing had happened, like it was just another Tuesday. Which I suppose for him it was. I thought about going to find out more about the man in the black jacket. His name, his competition record, what had brought him to that specific stretch of London Road on that specific Tuesday. I decided against it. Because the story, I realized, wasn't really about him. The story was about a principle, about what it costs when someone builds their entire identity around the ability to overpower others, and then encounters something that doesn't run on that currency. He was a champion, I don't doubt that. Whatever trophies he had, whatever rankings, whatever competitive record, I believe it was real. He wasn't a fraud. He was genuinely formidable. But formidable is a relative term. And he'd made the mistake of forgetting that. There was one more thing. After the police left and the crowd thinned, I walked past the point where the horse had been standing. There was nothing to mark the spot. No evidence of what had happened there 20 minutes before. I stopped anyway. There was a single scuff mark on the road's surface, probably from when the man had gone down, his shoe catching the tarmac. That was it. That was the entire physical legacy of a man who'd walked into that morning, so certain of his own power that he'd hit a soldier's horse and smirked at the soldier. One scuff mark, gone by the afternoon, most likely, under the ordinary traffic of an ordinary London day. 3 days after it happened, I went back. Not for any particular reason, or not a reason I could articulate clearly. I'd finished the catalog work by then, last shoot had been Wednesday morning, and my flight home wasn't until Saturday. I had time. I told myself I wanted to see whether the procession looked different to me now, whether knowing what I knew about the man on that horse changed how the ritual felt. I stood in almost exactly the same spot. The weather had changed. Cleaner air, a bit of actual sun coming through in the way London sun does in late autumn, horizontal and gold and a little apologetic about itself, like it knows it's overdue. The crowd was smaller on a Friday afternoon. Maybe 40 people, less camera equipment, quieter in general. The horses came through at the usual time. And standing there, watching them move through the city, these enormous, controlled animals carrying these still, formal riders through the noise and press of modern London, I found myself understanding something I'd been circling around for 3 days. It's easy to mistake formality for weakness. That's the mistake that man made. He saw the ceremony, the choreography, the rules about not reacting, the proscription against breaking posture or responding to provocation. He saw all the constraint of the role and he thought, constraint means limitation. Limitation means vulnerability. He wasn't stupid. The calculation wasn't unreasonable if you applied it to most contexts. But it was wrong here, profoundly wrong. Because what looks like constraint from the outside is often something else entirely. What looks like a man who cannot respond because the rules won't allow it is sometimes just a man who has chosen not to respond yet. Who has the capacity and is simply waiting for the right moment, the right threshold, the right justification. And when the man in the black jacket crossed that threshold, when he introduced actual physical violence into the equation by striking the horse, he didn't weaken the trooper's position. He freed it. He gave the trooper permission to respond. And the trooper, as it turned out, had been carrying rather more capability than the karate champion had accounted for. I'm not a soldier. I've never been trained to fight. I have no expert framework for assessing what happened in those 4 seconds on the road. But I've spent time since that Tuesday reading about the Household Cavalry's selection and training. Not because I was writing about it. I'm not. This is just something I'm telling you because it happened and it matters, but because I was curious. Because I wanted to understand what I'd seen. What I found was this. The ceremonial role is not the only role. The men who ride those routes are not selected purely for their ability to sit perfectly still on a horse in the rain while tourists take photographs. The selection pipeline is demanding in ways that go well beyond bearing and presentation. The training encompasses things that have nothing to do with ceremony, and everything to do with the kind of situations that require a different kind of discipline entirely. The man in the black jacket had done his assessment on the wrong data. He'd looked at the surface and thought he'd understood the depth. The other thing I've thought about, and this is the part that gets more complicated, is what motivated him to do it in the first place. Because violence like that doesn't come from nowhere. Nobody wakes up on a Tuesday morning and decides randomly to punch a Royal Guards horse. There's a thread that leads there, a sequence of smaller decisions that have to accumulate before a person arrives at a moment like that one. I think about the smirk. That specific, small smirk when the trooper first halted and looked down at him. That smirk is a person saying, "I know how this works and I'm not afraid of it." But underneath that, there's another translation, something more honest. The smirk is also a person saying, "See me. Acknowledge that I exist and that I'm capable of this." It's performance. The whole thing was performance. And performance, even aggressive performance, even destructive performance, is usually a signal about something someone needs that they're not getting through ordinary channels. I'm not excusing it. I want to be clear about that. He struck an animal. He initiated a confrontation that put people around him at potential risk. The consequences he received, the physical correction from the trooper, the police involvement, whatever followed legally and professionally, were his to carry. But I can hold both things at once. What he did was wrong, and it came from somewhere recognizably human. The week I got home, I mentioned the incident to my brother. He's someone who follows competitive martial arts fairly closely. I described the man, the build, the age range, the confidence, and mentioned the woman who'd thought she recognized him from television coverage. My brother didn't identify anyone specific. He said, "That sounds like a type, though." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Fighters who have been very successful. Sometimes they develop this thing where the fighting and the person become the same thing. Like the capability stops being a tool they have and starts being who they are. And then they need to keep proving it, even in contexts where it doesn't apply." He paused and then added, "The good ones know the difference between who they are and what they can do. The ones who get into trouble are the ones who have lost that line." I wrote that down afterward because it felt exact. It felt like the cleanest description of what I'd watched happen on that road. There's a thing I keep coming back to about the trooper specifically. After it was done, after the man was on the ground and the police had been called and the situation was resolved, the trooper went back to his horse. He put his hand on the animal's neck. Just rested it there, quietly. A gesture that wasn't ceremonial, wasn't formal. Was just a person checking on an animal that had been struck. The horse turned its head slightly, just slightly, the way horses do when they're making contact with something familiar. And the trooper stood there, his hand on that neck, while everything around him normalized. I've thought about that gesture more than anything else. Because it contained the whole thing, didn't it? It contained what had actually happened and what had actually mattered. The karate champion, the man who'd walked into that morning with his whole identity assembled around what he could do with his body, had made the horse the center of his confrontation, had chosen the horse as the point of demonstration. And the trooper had responded to the human threat with the efficiency it required, and then he'd turned immediately back to the animal. To check on it, to reassure it. To put his hand on its neck. That's the image, that's the one that stayed. I spoke in the weeks after I got home to someone who had worked in a professional capacity adjacent to the military. Not household cavalry specifically, but adjacent and familiar enough with the culture to speak to it. I described what I'd seen, the confrontation, the 4 seconds, the trooper's expression in the moments before he moved. This person listened without interrupting. Then they said, "The face you're describing, the one that's not angry, the one that's making a decision, they practice for that." I asked what they meant. Emotional discipline. Controlling what your face does, what your body does under stress. Not suppressing the emotion's there, but not letting it drive. It's a skill, takes years. They paused. The thing that makes a fighter like that champion dangerous in a ring is also the thing that works against him in a situation like this. In a ring, his emotion, his ego, his need to dominate, that's fuel. It's an asset. Outside a ring against someone who's specifically trained not to be reactive, that ego becomes the handle that he can be grabbed by. I thought about the smirk. about the open palm challenge stance. The trooper hadn't needed to match the champion's energy. He just needed to wait for the champion to commit, to lean forward, to make the first move, and then use that commitment against him. The champion's confidence had been the mechanism of his own undoing. I want to talk about what happened to the horse, because that detail matters and I feel like it's gotten somewhat lost in the larger story. From what I was able to gather from a person I know who is familiar with the regiment's procedures, the gelding was examined following the incident. Full veterinary assessment. He was found to be, and this is the outcome that still strikes me, honestly, entirely fine. The punch had been hard, but he was a large, well-conditioned animal and had been struck on the flank, not in any way that caused lasting injury. He was back on duty, by all accounts, within the week. Which, if you wanted to build an analogy, is right there ready-made. The thing that was supposed to be the point of impact, the demonstration, the proof of capability, it barely registered. The horse healed in days. The man who struck him will carry what happened on that road for considerably longer. I've been trying to decide, as I've worked through all of this, what the lesson actually is. Not the lesson for him, that's fairly self-evident, and he's the one who had to receive it, not me. But the broader lesson, the thing that makes this worth telling. Because it would be easy to make this a simple story about hubris, the prideful man brought low, the lesson about not underestimating what you're dealing with. That's all true, and it's all in there. But I think there's something underneath that which is more interesting. It's about what discipline actually means. The karate champion had physical discipline, real, hard-won, genuinely impressive physical discipline. He'd built his body and his technique over years. Whatever he could do in competition, whatever scores he'd achieved, whatever opponents he'd beaten, was the result of actual work. But discipline isn't just physical, and this is the part he'd missed. The trooper standing there on that road had a different kind of discipline, the discipline of not responding to provocation, of holding position, of trusting the system, the protocol, the law, the institution, to back him up rather than taking personal action before the moment required it. And when the moment required it, he had that too. The physical capability was absolutely present. But the discipline he'd been exercising in the minutes before the confrontation, the stillness, the patience, the willingness to not react even when provoked, that was arguably harder, arguably rarer. The champion had trained his body to be a weapon. The trooper had trained himself to be something more than that. I flew home on the Saturday. Gatwick was its usual pleasant chaos. Too many people, too little coffee, too many departure boards updating at the wrong moment. I sat in a cafe near my gate and thought about writing something down, and then didn't. Felt too soon. Now it doesn't feel too soon. Now it just feels like something that happened, and that I was present for, and that I haven't quite been able to stop turning over in my mind. Not because it was dramatic, though it was. Not because it was violent, though it was, briefly, but because of that hand on the horse's neck. Because after everything, after the confrontation and the fall and the police and the crowd and the whole charged, strange, London autumn morning of it, what the trooper did was go back to the animal. Check that it was okay. Just stand there quietly with his hand on the horse. Everything else would be processed, statements taken, reports filed, whatever came next in the formal machinery of law and military protocol. But right then, in that immediate moment, the trooper's first concern was the horse. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about who was the better man on that road. The crowd dispersed. The sun came through in that late autumn London way. The procession continued because it always continues, because that's the point, because the continuity of it is itself the statement. And the road was quiet again. Just a stretch of tarmac in a city that moves on quickly because it has to, because it's London and London doesn't hold its breath for anyone. Just a scuff mark where someone had fallen. Just a horse that was fine. Just a trooper riding, steady and unhurried, back toward the barracks. The same as always. The same as every day. Like nothing had happened at all. Some men mistake silence for weakness. Some men mistake ceremony for fragility. And some men spend the rest of their lives understanding the difference between the two, not because someone explained it to them, but because they found out the hard way on a Tuesday morning in London, in front of 60 strangers with phones.